Before I tell you what happened at our golden anniversary party, I need you to understand something about secrets. They're like cancer, they start small, but they grow in the darkness, feeding on silence and shame until they consume everything around them. I carried a secret for 50 years. Today, I'm going to tell you what happened when I finally decided to cut it out. My name is Helen Patricia Thornton. Well, it was Thornton before I became Helen Morrison. And if you ask anyone in our small town of Millbrook, they'll tell you I'm the luckiest woman alive. 50 years married to Frank Morrison, a pillar of the community, successful businessman, devoted husband and father. They'll tell you we're the perfect example of true love lasting a lifetime. They'll tell you I should count my blessings every single day. They don't know what I know. They don't see what I see when I look in the mirror every morning. They don't hear what I hear when Frank tells his stories about our courtship. They don't feel what I feel when he touches my shoulder and smiles for photos. But let me start at the beginning, because this story doesn't start with a golden anniversary. It starts with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 days before the party that was supposed to celebrate our perfect love. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I've eaten breakfast for 48 years, when the mail carrier knocked. Most days, I get bills and advertisements, maybe a card from one of the grandchildren. But that day, there was a letter with unfamiliar handwriting, postmarked from Portland, Oregon. The return address read Margaret Morrison, not related to my husband, just sharing the same common last name. But when I opened that letter, my hands started shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Margaret was writing to tell me that her brother David had died. David Morrison, the man I was supposed to marry in June of 1974. The man I loved with every fiber of my 19-year-old heart. The man whose engagement ring I'd worn for exactly 4 months before everything changed. David had died peacefully in his sleep at 73, and Margaret thought I should know because she'd found something in his belongings that she felt belonged to me. My engagement ring. The small diamond solitaire he'd saved for 6 months to buy, working double shifts at the lumber mill to afford it. He'd kept it in his wallet for 50 years, along with a photo of us together at the church picnic where he proposed. Margaret wrote that David never married, never had children, never found another woman who could make him forget his first love. She said he used to tell her that I was the one who got away, and he spent his whole life wondering what he'd done wrong, why I'd vanished without explanation. David had died still believing I'd chosen someone else. Still believing I'd broken our engagement, because I'd fallen in love with Frank Morrison. Still believing that the woman he'd planned to spend his life with had simply decided she didn't want him anymore. I sat in that kitchen and cried for the first time in years. Not the quiet, careful tears I'd learned to shed in private, but great, gulping sobs that came from somewhere deep inside my chest. I cried for David, who'd lived his whole life thinking he wasn't good enough. I cried for the children we never had, the life we never built, the love that was murdered before it could bloom. But mostly, I cried from rage, pure, white-hot rage that had been building inside me for 50 years. Because David Morrison didn't lose me. Frank Morrison took me. Let me tell you about David first, because he deserves to be remembered properly. David was 21 when we met at a church social in 1973. I was 18, fresh out of high school, working at my father's diner to save money for college. David was studying to be a teacher, quiet and thoughtful, with kind eyes and gentle hands that never grabbed, or demanded, or took without permission. He courted me the way girls dream of being courted. He asked my father's permission to take me to the county fair. He brought me wildflowers he'd picked himself. He listened when I talked about my dreams of maybe becoming a nurse someday, of seeing something beyond the borders of our small town. He made me feel like those dreams were possible, like I was someone worth investing in. When he proposed under the old oak tree behind the Methodist church, I said yes without hesitation. We planned our wedding for June 15, 1974. I'd already picked out my dress, a simple white gown with lace sleeves that I'd found at the department store in the county seat. David's mother had offered to make the cake. My mother was planning the flowers from her garden. I was so happy I could barely contain it. I felt like I was living in a fairy tale, like all the good things I'd ever dreamed of were finally coming true. That's when Frank Morrison decided he wanted me. Frank was 24, 3 years older than David, and everything David wasn't. Where David was quiet, Frank was loud. Where David was thoughtful, Frank was impulsive. Where David asked permission, Frank took what he wanted and dealt with the consequences later. Frank owned a small construction company he'd inherited from his father. He had money, charm, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. He drove a brand new pickup truck, and wore expensive boots, and had never worked a day in someone else's business. He started coming into the diner every morning, ordering coffee, and trying to flirt with me. I was polite, but distant. I was engaged, after all, and deeply in love with my fiancé. But Frank didn't seem to understand that my disinterest was genuine. He treated it like a game, like I was playing hard to make myself more attractive. "Come on, Helen," he'd say, leaning across the counter with that cocky smile. "One little date won't hurt anything. I'll show you how a real man treats a lady." I'd tell him I was engaged, that I wasn't interested, that I'd appreciate it if he'd stop asking. But Frank Morrison wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer. He'd just laugh and say something like, "That Morrison boy, he's nothing but a dreamer. You need someone who can actually provide for you." The harassment went on for months. Frank would show up at the diner, at church, at the grocery store. He'd insert himself into conversations, make comments about how I was too good for David, hint that I'd be better off with someone who had real money and real prospects. David knew about it, of course. It was a small town, and people talked. But David trusted me, and I trusted myself. We laughed about Frank's persistence, secure in our love and our plans for the future. I should have been more worried. I should have seen the signs of what was coming. But I was 19 and naive, and I thought the worst thing Frank could do was make me uncomfortable. I was wrong. The night that changed everything was April 3, 1974, 2.5 months before my wedding. I was working the evening shift at the diner, and I was supposed to close up alone, something I'd done dozens of times before. David was supposed to pick me up at 9 o'clock when I finished cleaning, but around 8:30, he called to say his car had broken down, and he was waiting for his brother to come help him. "I'll be about an hour late," he said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Can you wait inside until I get there?" I told him not to worry, that I'd be fine. The diner was on Main Street, well lit and visible from the road. I'd lock the door and wait inside until he arrived. What could go wrong? Frank Morrison showed up at 8:45. I was wiping down tables when I heard someone trying the front door. I looked up and saw Frank's face pressed against the glass, his hands cupped around his eyes to see inside. When he saw me looking, he smiled and waved. "Helen," he called through the glass. "Open up. I heard David's car broke down. I'll give you a ride home." I shook my head and pointed to my watch, indicating that we were closed. But Frank kept knocking, kept calling my name. Finally, against my better judgment, I walked to the door. "We're closed, Frank," I said through the glass. "David's coming to get me." "Not for another hour," Frank said. "Come on, Helen. It's cold out here, and you shouldn't be alone. Let me drive you home." I should have said no. I should have told him to leave. I should have called my father or David's brother or anyone else. But Frank had always been persistent, and I was tired of fighting him off. I thought maybe if I accepted his offer of a ride, he'd finally leave me alone. I was so stupid. So unbelievably, dangerously stupid. I grabbed my purse and my jacket, and unlocked the door. Frank was all smiles and charm, holding the door open for me, helping me into his truck like a perfect gentleman. He even made small talk about the weather as we drove through town. But when we reached the turn that would take us to my parents' house, Frank kept driving straight. "You missed the turn," I said, looking back over my shoulder. "I know," Frank said, and something in his voice made my blood run cold. "I want to talk to you about something first." He drove us to the Sleepy Inn, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions. When he parked in front of one of the units, I realized what was happening. "Frank, take me home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right now." "In a minute," he said, turning off the engine. "I just want to talk." "We can talk in the truck. Take me home." But Frank was already getting out, walking around to my side of the vehicle. When he opened my door, I didn't move. "Get out, Helen." "No." That's when his whole demeanor changed. The charming smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and determined. He grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the truck, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "Frank, you're hurting me. You're going to listen to me," he said, dragging me toward the motel room. "You're going to understand how much I care about you." He had a key. He'd planned this. While I was working and David was dealing with his broken down car, and our families were probably sitting down to dinner, Frank Morrison had rented a motel room and planned to drag me there. I fought him. I want to be clear about that. I didn't go quietly or willingly. I scratched at his face, tried to kick him, screamed until my throat was raw. But Frank was bigger and stronger, and there was no one around to hear me. The next hour was the longest of my life. Frank kept telling me he loved me, that he'd treat me better than David ever could, that I'd thank him for this someday. He acted like he was doing me a favor, like he was rescuing me from a mistake. When it was over, I was bleeding and bruised and broken in ways I didn't have words for. Frank straightened his clothes and combed his hair like nothing had happened. "I'll take you home now," he said, as if we'd just had a normal conversation. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I just sat in his truck and stared out the window while he drove me back to town, humming under his breath like he was satisfied with his night's work. He dropped me off at the end of my street, not wanting to drive up to the house where my parents might see his truck. Before I got out, he grabbed my hand. "Helen," he said, and his voice was gentle again, like the Frank who'd been courting me all those months. "I hope you understand now how much you mean to me. I hope you'll think about what I said." I yanked my hand away and stumbled out of the truck. He drove away slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I walked home in the dark, my clothes torn, my body aching, my mind spinning with shock and fear and shame. David was sitting on my parents' front porch, waiting for me. When he saw me in the porch light, his face went white. "Helen, what happened? Are you hurt?" I couldn't tell him. I couldn't tell anyone. I just said I'd fallen, that I'd hurt myself walking home from the diner. David was so concerned, so gentle, helping me inside and asking if I needed a doctor. His kindness made everything worse. I went to bed that night and lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. I could report Frank to the police, but it would be his word against mine, and everyone knew he'd been pursuing me for months. They'd say I'd led him on, that I'd asked for it. I could tell David, but what would that accomplish except to hurt him and maybe get him hurt, if he tried to confront Frank? I decided to stay quiet and hope Frank would leave me alone now that he'd gotten what he wanted. I was wrong about that, too. 3 days later, I missed my period. A week after that, I was throwing up every morning. By the end of April, I knew I was pregnant. I was 19 years old, unmarried, and carrying the child of the man who'd raped me. In 1974, in a small conservative town, there weren't many options for girls like me. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. Single motherhood was a scandal that would destroy my family's reputation and my own future. I didn't know what to do. I was scared and ashamed and completely alone. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the growing certainty that my life was over. Finally, I broke down and told my mother. I'll never forget the look on her face when I finished my story. Not sympathy or outrage or maternal protectiveness. Just cold, calculating assessment of the damage to our family's reputation. "You foolish girl," she said. "How could you let this happen?" "I didn't let anything happen, Mama. He forced me." "You got in his truck, didn't you? You went with him willingly." "I thought he was giving me a ride home." "Well, now look what you've done. What's David going to say? What's the whole town going to say?" My mother called my father in from the fields. The two of them sat me down at the kitchen table and asked me to tell the story again. When I finished, my father was quiet for a long time. "Frank Morrison," he finally said. "Yes, sir. His daddy owns Morrison Supply. We buy all our restaurant equipment from them." I didn't understand why that mattered. I didn't understand a lot of things that were about to happen. My father called Frank's father, Harold Morrison, and asked him to come over for a talk. Harold arrived within the hour, and the two men sat in our living room while my mother and I waited in the kitchen. I could hear the murmur of their voices, but couldn't make out the words. After about an hour, my father called me in. "Helen," he said, "Harold's going to talk to Frank about what happened." Harold Morrison was a big man, like his son, with the same confident bearing and expensive clothes. He looked at me with the kind of assessment you'd give a piece of livestock you were considering buying. "This is a serious accusation, young lady," he said. "Are you sure you want to make it?" "It's not an accusation. It's the truth. Frank says you've been encouraging his attention for months. Says you invited him to pick you up that night." "That's a lie." Harold shrugged. "Well, somebody's lying. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" My father leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this kind of talk could hurt both our families, both our businesses. Might be better for everyone if we found a way to resolve this quietly." That's when I started to understand what was happening. This wasn't about justice or protection, or even acknowledgement of what Frank had done to me. This was about damage control. "Frank's a good boy," Harold continued. "Made a mistake, maybe got a little too enthusiastic in his courtship, but he's got good intentions. He wants to do right by your daughter." "What are you saying?" my mother asked. "I'm saying Frank wants to marry Helen, make an honest woman of her, give that baby a name and a father." The room went silent. I felt like I was falling down a deep well, everything getting smaller and darker around me. "No," I said, "I'm engaged to David. I'm not marrying Frank." "Helen," my father said quietly, "David's not going to want you now. Not carrying another man's child. It's not another man's child. It's a rapist's child. And David loves me. He'll understand." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. This was 1974. Good girls didn't get raped, and if they did, they certainly didn't get pregnant from it. David was a good man, but he was also a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Why would he want to marry someone who was damaged goods? Harold Morrison stood up and adjusted his tie. "I'll give you folks some time to think about it. But Frank's serious about this. He's ready to do the right thing." After he left, my parents and I sat in the living room in silence. Finally, my father spoke. "Helen, I think you should consider it." "Consider what?" "Marrying my rapist. Consider giving that baby a father and yourself a husband. Frank's got money, got a good business. He could provide for you." "I don't want his money. I want to marry David." My mother sighed. "Honey, you can't marry David now. You're ruined for marriage to anyone decent. Frank Morrison is offering to overlook what happened and make you respectable again." "Overlook what happened? He's the one who did it." "Keep your voice down," my father said sharply. "The neighbors don't need to hear our business." That night, I called David from the phone in my parents' bedroom. I was going to tell him everything about Frank, about the rape, about the baby. I was going to trust in our love and hope he'd stand by me. But when I heard his voice, so warm and trusting and full of love, I couldn't do it. I couldn't destroy his faith in me, couldn't burden him with my shame, couldn't ask him to raise another man's child. Instead, I told him I needed to postpone the wedding. "Just for a little while," I said. Some family issues had come up that needed to be resolved first. "What kind of family issues?" he asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "I can't really talk about it right now, but I promise I'll explain everything soon." "Helen, you're scaring me. Whatever it is, we can work through it together." "I know," I said, and I was crying now. "I just need some time." 3 days later, Frank showed up at our front door with flowers and a ring. Not an engagement ring, a wedding ring. He sat in our living room and formally asked my father for my hand in marriage. "I know we've had our misunderstandings," he said, looking at me with those cold eyes that had never shown a hint of remorse. "But I care about Helen deeply, and I want to make her my wife." My father looked at me expectantly. My mother nodded encouragingly. Harold Morrison sat beside his son, smiling like he was watching a heartwarming family moment. "Helen doesn't have a choice," I said finally. "Does she?" "You always have a choice," Frank said. "You can choose to do the right thing." The wedding was planned for June 1, 1974. Exactly 2 weeks before I was supposed to marry David. I had to break the engagement. That was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. I called David and told him I'd changed my mind, that I'd fallen in love with someone else. Someone else, he said, and his voice was so small and hurt it broke my heart. Who? Frank Morrison. There was a long silence. Frank Morrison. Helen, that doesn't make sense. You told me you couldn't stand him. I was wrong. I was confused. I thought I loved you, but I realized I was just scared of being with a real man. I used Frank's own words, repeated the cruel things he'd said about David over the months. Every word felt like poison in my mouth, but I kept talking, kept hurting the man I loved, because I thought it would be easier for him if he hated me. I don't understand, David said, and I could hear him crying. Helen, if this is about money, about security, we can work it out. I'll quit school, get a job, do whatever you need. It's not about money. It's about love. I love Frank, not you. You love Frank Morrison. Yes, the man who's been harassing you for months. He wasn't harassing me. He was courting me. I was just too stupid to see it. There was another long silence. Then David said, very quietly, I hope you'll be happy, Helen. I hope he makes you happy. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat on my parents' bed and sobbed until there were no tears left. The wedding was small and quick, like Harold Morrison had suggested. Just immediate family and a few close friends. I wore my mother's old dress, altered to hide my growing belly. Frank wore a new suit and smiled like he'd won the lottery. I stood at the altar and promised to love, honor, and obey the man who'd raped me. I said the words that bound my life to his, that gave him legal ownership of my body and my future. I slipped the ring onto my finger like I was putting on handcuffs. After the ceremony, at the small reception in the church basement, people came up to congratulate us. They talked about how romantic it was, how Frank had swept me off my feet, how lucky I was to marry such a successful man. Mrs. Henderson, who taught Sunday school, squeezed my hand and said, I always knew you two would end up together. The way he looked at you, like you were the only girl in the world. I smiled and nodded and thanked her for coming. I played the part of the happy bride, because that's what everyone expected. But inside, I felt like I was dying. David left town after the wedding. I heard he'd transferred to a college in Oregon to finish his teaching degree. He never came back to visit, never attended any of the high school reunions or town festivals. It was like he'd been erased from our community, like our love had never existed at all. I moved into Frank's house, a big colonial on Elm Street that had belonged to his grandparents. It was a beautiful house, with hardwood floors and tall windows and a wraparound porch. It should have been a dream home for a young bride. Instead, it felt like a prison. Frank was charming to everyone else, but controlling with me. He wanted to know where I was every minute of the day. He chose my clothes, my friends, my activities. He presented it as caring, as protection, but I knew it was ownership. He never apologized for what he'd done to me. Never acknowledged that he'd raped me or forced me into marriage. In his mind, he'd rescued me from a life of mediocrity, with David, and given me everything a woman could want. When I was 7 months pregnant, we ran into David's mother at the grocery store. She looked at my belly and then at my face, and I saw the exact moment she realized the timeline didn't add up. Helen, she said quietly, when is the baby due? December, I said. She did the math in her head. December baby, June wedding. That meant I'd gotten pregnant in March, when I was still engaged to her son. I see, she said, and her voice was cold as winter. Well, I hope you're happy with your choices. She walked away without another word, and I knew she'd go home and tell David's father, who would probably write to David in Oregon. I could imagine David getting that letter, learning that his former fiancée had been pregnant with another man's child when she'd broken their engagement. I hoped he'd think I'd been cheating on him. It was better than the truth. Sarah was born on December 15, 1974. She was perfect and beautiful and completely innocent of the circumstances of her conception. I held her in my arms and promised her that I'd never let anyone hurt her the way I'd been hurt. Frank was a good father, I'll give him that. He loved Sarah fiercely and provided for her generously. He was patient with her tantrums, proud of her accomplishments, protective of her innocence. Sometimes I could almost forget what he'd done to me when I watched him with our daughter. But then night would come, and he'd expect his marital rights, and I'd remember exactly who I was married to. 2 years later, I got pregnant again. This time it was planned, or at least, Frank had planned it. He wanted a son, and what Frank wanted, Frank got. Michael was born in 1977, and Frank's joy was complete. He had his heir, his legacy, his perfect family. I loved my children desperately, but I couldn't love their father. I went through the motions of being a wife, but every touch felt like a violation, every kiss like a betrayal of my own soul. I learned to dissociate, to float outside my body during the worst moments, to pretend I was somewhere else with someone else. The years passed. Sarah started school, then Michael. I threw myself into motherhood and community activities, anything to keep busy, anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts. I joined the PTA, volunteered at church, organized bake sales and charity drives. I became the perfect minister's wife, except I wasn't married to a minister, I was married to my rapist. Frank's business prospered. We moved to a bigger house, took family vacations, sent the kids to good schools. From the outside, we looked like the American dream. Frank made sure of that. He loved showing off his family, his successful marriage, his beautiful wife who'd chosen him over that nobody, David Morrison. But I never forgot David. I thought about him every day, wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he'd found someone to love. I hoped he had. I hoped he was happy in a way I'd never be. The children grew up. Sarah went to college, then law school. She became a successful attorney, and married a good man named Robert. Michael became a teacher, ironic, since that's what David had wanted to be. He married his college sweetheart, Jennifer, and they had 2 children of their own. Both of my children adored their father. To them, Frank was a provider, a protector, a man who'd built a good life for his family. They didn't see the man who'd raped their mother and forced her into marriage. They saw the man who'd coached their little league teams and attended their school plays and paid for their educations. I never told them the truth. How could I? They were innocent of their father's crimes, and I wasn't going to destroy their relationship with him to ease my own burden. Besides, who would believe me? It had been my word against Frank's for 30 years. Time had only made the lie more entrenched. Frank retired at 65, which meant he was home all day, every day. The house that had felt like a prison before became a tomb. He followed me from room to room, commenting on everything I did, criticizing my cooking, my cleaning, my appearance. He'd gotten older and meaner, more possessive and controlling. I developed high blood pressure, and had to take medication. I had trouble sleeping and sometimes found myself crying for no reason. My doctor suggested I might be depressed, but how could I explain the source of my depression without revealing secrets I'd kept for decades? When Frank turned 70, Sarah decided to throw him a surprise birthday party. She invited everyone we'd ever known, neighbors, business associates, old friends, distant relatives. They all came to celebrate Frank Morrison, pillar of the community, devoted husband and father. I stood in my living room and watched people toast my husband's life, his accomplishments, his character. They talked about what a good man he was, how lucky I was to be married to him, how they hoped they'd have a marriage like ours someday. I smiled and nodded and thanked them for coming. I played the part of the proud wife, because that's what everyone expected. But inside, I was screaming. That night, after everyone had gone home and Frank was in bed, I sat in the kitchen and thought about ending it all. Not suicide, I wasn't brave enough for that, but maybe running away, disappearing, starting over somewhere else where no one knew my story. But I was 70 years old. Where would I go? What would I do? I had no money of my own, no skills outside of being a wife and mother. I was trapped as surely as I'd been at 19, just older and more tired. Then Margaret's letter arrived, and everything changed. Reading about David's death, learning that he'd carried our engagement ring for 50 years, discovering that he'd never stopped loving me, it broke something open inside me that had been sealed shut for decades. David Morrison had died believing I'd betrayed him. He'd spent his whole life thinking he wasn't good enough, that I'd chosen someone better, that our love hadn't been real. He died alone, childless, still wondering what he'd done wrong. And Frank had gotten away with it all. He'd taken me, taken my future, taken my children's real father, and he'd been celebrated for it. He'd been rewarded with a successful business, a respected position in the community, and a wife who'd been too broken to fight back. I was 72 years old, and I was done. The golden anniversary party was Sarah's idea, of course. She'd been planning it for months, the invitations, the catering, the photographer, the decorations. She wanted it to be perfect, a celebration of enduring love that would be remembered for years to come. You and Dad are an inspiration, she told me while we were addressing invitations. 50 years of marriage is incredible. You're going to have to tell everyone your secret. Our secret. How you've stayed so happy together for so long. What's the key to a lasting marriage? I looked at my daughter, this successful, confident woman who'd built a good life for herself, and I realized she had no idea what her parents' marriage really was. She'd grown up in a house where her mother flinched when her father touched her, where conversations were stilted and careful, where love was performed rather than felt. But she'd been a child. Children see what they need to see to feel safe. I don't know if I'd call it happiness, I said carefully. What would you call it then? I thought about it. Endurance. Sarah laughed. That's so like you, Mom. Always so modest. You and Dad have the kind of love people write songs about. If they did, it would be a very different kind of song than she imagined. The morning of the party, I woke up and knew I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stand in front of all those people and pretend to celebrate a love that had never existed. I couldn't listen to Frank tell his stories about our courtship, couldn't watch people toast our perfect marriage, couldn't smile and accept congratulations for surviving 50 years of captivity. I got dressed in the blue dress Sarah had chosen, put on my pearls, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like every other 72-year-old woman getting ready for a party, but I felt like a volcano about to erupt. I went downstairs to find Frank in the living room, straightening his tie and humming under his breath. He looked happy, excited about the party, about being the center of attention, about having his long, successful marriage celebrated by the whole community. You look beautiful, Helen, he said, and for just a moment, I could see the young man who'd pursued me so relentlessly 50 years ago. The charm was still there, the confidence, the absolute certainty that he deserved whatever he wanted. Thank you, I said. This is going to be a wonderful day, he said. All our friends and family, celebrating what we've built together. What we've built. 50 years, Helen. 50 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, 4 grandchildren. We've had a good life. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he believed what he was saying. In his mind, he had given me a good life. He'd provided for me, protected me, been faithful to me. The fact that it had all started with rape was just an unfortunate detail that he'd long since forgotten, or rewritten in his memory. That's when I knew I had to tell the truth. Not for revenge, not for justice, but for David. For the man who'd died still believing he wasn't good enough for me. For the love that had been murdered before it could bloom. For the 50 years I'd spent pretending to be grateful for my own destruction. The party started at 2 o'clock. By 3, the house was packed with people I'd known for decades. Neighbors, business associates, church friends, extended family members who'd driven in from out of state. Sarah had done a beautiful job with the decorations, white roses and gold ribbons everywhere, photos of Frank and me through the years displayed on tables throughout the house. Looking at those photos was like looking at evidence of a crime. There I was at our wedding, 19 years old and hollow-eyed, standing as far from Frank as possible while still being in the same frame. There we were with baby Sarah, me holding her protectively while Frank smiled for the camera. There we were at various family gatherings over the years, me always looking like I was somewhere else, Frank always looking like he owned the world. The photographer Sarah had hired was taking pictures of everything, the decorations, the food, the guests mingling and laughing. She wanted to document every moment of this perfect day. Frank held court in the living room, telling stories to anyone who would listen. The same stories he'd been telling for 50 years, polished and perfected with each retelling. Helen was the prettiest girl in town, he was saying to a group of our neighbors. But she was shy, you know. Took me months to convince her to go out with me. Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived next door for 20 years, laughed. Frank, you old charmer. I bet you swept her right off her feet. Well, I was persistent, Frank said with that same cocky smile I'd been seeing for 50 years. Had to convince her she was making a mistake with that other fellow she was engaged to. What was his name, Helen? David something. Every head in the room turned to look at me. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catch. Frank knew exactly what he was doing. He'd been baiting me with David's name for decades, enjoying the way it made me flinch. David Morrison, I said quietly. That's right, David Morrison. Nice enough boy, but no ambition. Helen deserved better than a schoolteacher's salary. Mr. Henderson from the hardware store nodded approvingly. Smart girl, choosing security over romance. That's what makes a marriage last. Oh, there was plenty of romance, Frank said, winking at the crowd. Wasn't there, sweetheart? Tell them about our first real date. The room fell silent, waiting for me to contribute to Frank's mythology. This was my cue to smile and blush and tell some sanitized version of our courtship that would make everyone sigh and wish they had a love story like ours. Instead, I looked directly at Frank and said, I don't think that's a story I want to tell. Frank's smile flickered for just a moment. Come on, Helen. Don't be shy. I'm not being shy, Frank. I just don't think rape is appropriate dinner party conversation. The word hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. I could see people's faces changing, confusion replacing their indulgent smiles. Someone's wine glass stopped halfway to their lips. The photographer lowered her camera. Frank's face went white, then red. Helen, what are you? I'm telling the truth, I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. For the first time in 50 years, I'm telling the truth. Sarah appeared at my elbow, her face pale with panic. Mom, maybe you should sit down. You look a little. I look like a woman who's about to tell everyone what really happened 50 years ago. I turned to face the room full of guests, all of them staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Maybe sanity was overrated. You all think Frank and I have the perfect marriage, I continued. You think we're proof that true love lasts forever. You think I'm the luckiest woman in the world. Helen, stop. Frank's voice was sharp now, commanding. The voice he'd used on me in private for 5 decades. No, Frank, I'm not stopping. Not this time. I walked to the center of the room, where everyone could see me clearly. The photographer, confused but professional, kept taking pictures. Good. Let there be evidence of this moment. 50 years ago, I was engaged to David Morrison. I loved him with everything I had. We were going to be married on June 15, 1974. I had my dress picked out, the flowers planned, the whole future mapped out in front of us. People were looking back and forth between Frank and me like they were watching a tennis match. Frank's business partner, Jim, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Helen, he said gently, maybe this isn't the time. This is exactly the time, I said, because David Morrison died 3 months ago, and he died believing I'd betrayed him. He died thinking I'd chosen Frank over him, that I'd broken our engagement, because I didn't love him enough. I pulled Margaret's letter from my purse, where I'd been carrying it like a talisman for 3 days. David's sister wrote to me. She found our engagement ring in his wallet. He'd been carrying it for 50 years. He never married, never had children, because he never got over losing me. Frank took a step toward me. Helen, you're not well. You're confused. I'm not confused, Frank. I remember everything. April 3, 1974. The Sleepy Inn. Room 12. Frank's face went ashen. He remembered too. You convinced me to get in your truck, I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. You said you'd give me a ride home, while David was dealing with his broken-down car. But you didn't take me home, did you, Frank? Helen, stop this. Sarah's voice was pleading now. Please, whatever you think happened. I don't think anything happened, Sarah. I know what happened. Your father drove me to a motel room he'd already rented. He dragged me inside while I was screaming and fighting. And then he raped me. The word hit the room like a physical blow. Someone gasped. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth. The photographer finally stopped taking pictures. That's a lie, Frank said, but his voice was shaking. Helen, you're sick. You're imagining things. Am I imagining the pregnancy test I took 2 weeks later? Am I imagining the conversation with my parents about what to do with an unmarried pregnant girl? Am I imagining your father coming to our house to arrange the marriage that would make it all go away? Frank's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He looked around the room for support, for someone to tell him this wasn't happening. You raped me, I said again, louder this time. And then you married me to cover it up. And I've spent 50 years pretending to be grateful for it. Michael stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion and horror. Mom, that's impossible. Dad would never. Your father would and did. Sarah was born 8 months after our wedding, Michael. Do the math. Sarah was crying now, shaking her head. No, Mom. No, that's not true. You loved Dad. You chose him. I chose nothing, I said. I was 19 years old and pregnant with my rapist's baby. My parents made it clear that I had no other options. Either marry Frank, or be ruined forever. I looked around the room at all these people who'd known me for decades, who'd thought they understood my life. Frank Morrison didn't win me. He didn't charm me or court me or convince me to choose him. He took me. He stole me from the man I loved and the life I wanted. Frank finally found his voice. She's lying, he said desperately. She's having some kind of breakdown. Helen, honey, you need help. I needed help 50 years ago, I said. But nobody gave it to me. Instead, they gave me to you. The room was completely silent now except for Sarah's quiet sobbing. I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, successful daughter who'd been conceived in violence and born into a lie. I'm sorry you had to hear this, I told her. I'm sorry, I couldn't protect you from the truth, but I couldn't let David die thinking I'd betrayed him when the truth is that I never stopped loving him. I turned back to Frank, who was standing in the middle of his living room looking like his world was ending. Good. It was about time. You want to know the secret to our 50-year marriage? I asked the room. Rape and coercion. That's your romantic love story. I walked to the front door, my purse clutched in my shaking hands. I'm leaving, Frank. I should have left 50 years ago, but I was too scared and too broken. I'm not scared anymore. Helen, wait, Frank called after me. We can work this out. We can get you help. I turned back one last time, looking at this man who destroyed my life and convinced everyone he'd saved it. The only help I need is a divorce lawyer, I said. I'm going to call David's sister in Oregon. I'm going to tell her the truth about why I never married him. And then I'm going to figure out how to live the rest of my life as a free woman. I walked out of that house and never looked back. The last thing I heard was Frank trying to explain to the room full of stunned guests that I was having some kind of mental episode, that none of what I'd said was true. But I had already decided I didn't care what anyone believed. I'd spent 50 years caring about other people's opinions, other people's comfort, other people's version of the truth. I was 72 years old, and I was finally free. The next morning, I called Margaret Morrison in Portland. Through tears, I told her everything. About the rape, about the forced marriage, about the 50 years I'd spent as Frank's captive wife, about how David had been the love of my life, how I'd never stopped thinking about him, how I'd carried the weight of his broken heart along with my own. Margaret cried with me. She told me that David had talked about me until the day he died, that he'd kept that engagement ring as a reminder of the only woman he'd ever loved. She said he would have wanted to know the truth, would have wanted to know that I hadn't betrayed him. She also told me something that stopped me cold. David had tried to find me once, about 10 years after I'd married Frank. He'd driven back to our hometown and asked around about me. Frank had met him at the diner and told him that I was happily married with children, that I'd asked him to tell David not to contact me again. Even then, Frank had been controlling the narrative, making sure David believed the lie. Margaret sent me David's letters, boxes of them that he'd written but never sent. Letters telling me about his life in Oregon, about the children he'd taught, about the loneliness that never left him. Letters asking why I'd stopped loving him, what he'd done wrong, whether I ever thought about the life we'd planned together. Reading those letters nearly broke me all over again, but they also gave me something I'd been missing for 50 years, closure. The divorce was ugly. Frank fought it, of course, claiming I was mentally incompetent, that I was making up stories to hurt him. But I had allies now, Margaret, who flew in from Oregon to testify about David's letters, and a young female attorney, who believed my story and fought for me like I'd never been fought for before. Sarah and Michael struggled with the truth. Sarah eventually came around, apologizing for not seeing what had been right in front of her all those years. Michael took longer, unable to reconcile the father he'd known with the man I'd described. But blood is blood, and love is complicated, and we found our way back to each other eventually. Frank died 2 years after our divorce was finalized. Heart attack. I didn't go to the funeral. I'm 75 now, living in a small apartment in Portland, near Margaret. We've become friends, bonded by our shared love for David and our shared determination to keep his memory alive. She's shown me pictures of him throughout his life, the children he taught, the small house he lived in, the garden he kept in his backyard. He looked happy in some of the pictures. I hope he was, at least sometimes. I volunteer at a women's shelter now, helping other women find the courage to leave situations that seem impossible. I tell them what I wish someone had told me 50 years ago. It's never too late to reclaim your life. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver at 19. If I'd told the truth about Frank, consequences be damned. If I'd trusted David's love enough to tell him everything and ask him to stand by me. But I can't change the past. All I can do is live honestly in whatever time I have left. Last month, I visited David's grave. Margaret had told me where it was, the small cemetery outside Portland, with a view of the mountains he'd loved. I brought wildflowers, the kind he used to pick for me when we were young. I told him everything I'd never been able to say. I told him about the rape, about the forced marriage, about the 50 years I'd spent missing him. I told him about our children Sarah and Michael, who were his stepchildren in my heart, if not in biology. I told him about the grandchildren he'd never met, but who had his kindness in their eyes. Most importantly, I told him that he'd been enough, more than enough, that he'd been everything I'd ever wanted, and losing him had been the greatest tragedy of my life. I don't know if the dead can hear us, but I like to think David knows now. I like to think he understands that our love was real, that I never stopped loving him, that he was the only man I ever chose. Frank Morrison stole 50 years of my life, but he didn't steal my truth. And in the end, the truth is all any of us really have. I'm not the woman I was supposed to be. I'm not the wife, the mother, the grandmother I could have been if I'd been allowed to choose my own path. But I'm finally myself again, and that's something. It's not the ending I would have written for my story, but it's an ending where the truth wins, where love is finally honored, where a 72-year-old woman finds the courage to set herself free. And sometimes, that's enough.